If you're an entry-level screen printer currently using a 500-watt halogen light, the sun, or any other type of above exposure light, you're probably experiencing long exposure times and limitation when it comes to detail, especially when it comes to halftones. Well, it's time to forget about those things, because with Ryanet's new 16x20 RXP exposure unit, you can up your exposure detail, decrease your exposure times, and really step up your game with screen printing. This exposure unit features two unfiltered blacklight bulbs that expose the screen much faster than above exposure bulbs. Also, with the glass format, you can create compression which creates positive contact during screen exposure that allows you to get very fine detail, including halftones. Let's check out to see how this RXP 16x20 exposure unit works. Now let's go to screen exposure using the 16x20 RXP exposure unit. So typically, a screen like this that would come with a, one of our starter kits or DIY kits or semi-pro kits would expose in about 12 to 13 minutes using an above 500 watt halogen light. This exposure unit does it in probably 3 times faster than that. So there's exposure ranges that come with instructions included in this unit. We're exposing a 156 mesh screen, and we're going to expose it right at 3 minutes and 45 seconds. A 110 mesh would probably expose at 4 minutes. The mesh exposure ranges change depending on how much emulsion is in the mesh. The lower the mesh, like the 110 mesh, is going to hold a little bit more emulsion, so it's going to expose a little bit longer because it takes longer for that light to penetrate through the film. Now, once again, with an above exposure light, you can't have positive contact. And this is what I mean by positive contact. We take our screen, it has our film on it, and we also have an exposure calculator on this to ensure that our exposure times are correct. It's a very, very cheap investment for any shop to have, and if you really want to dial in your exposure times, I'd recommend investing in something like this. This is an exposure template strip that allows us to calculate our exposure times. Now, the starting points are listed in the exposure manual, and that's where you should always start out with, but this really helps you dial that in. So if we just have this placed on the screen like this, why don't you come in here and we can see what positive contact doesn't look like. Right here, we don't have any pressure pushing the screen mesh down to the image area and sandwiching this film between the glass. This is what you would get with an above exposure light. And you can actually see the blurriness right here in this edge. We wouldn't be able to expose a sharp edge very well if we don't have something pressing this together. So with the RXP 16x20 unit, we have a sheet of foam that sits in here like this that you put about 20 pounds, 25 pounds of pressure on. So I'm going to use 2 gallons of ink. You can use a dumbbell, but you want that pressure to be evenly distributed. And that creates that positive contact, pushing that mesh and sandwiching the film positive, the mesh, and the glass together so that light doesn't work its way around the edge of the image area. Enabling positive contact during screen exposure is huge, and all of our RXP exposure units, even including this entry-level one, the 16x20, allow you to do so. They all come with sheets of foam, and then you put your own weight on top of that. The more advanced ones have compression lids, which apply the weight automatically for you, and we also have vacuum units available. So this is definitely the entry-level one, and it does expose very, very good quality screens because it doesn't really matter the light source. Even though it's smaller, having that positive contact by this exposure unit format is the key. Second, speed. Speed is huge. We're going to expose the screen in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. It's a 156 mesh screen using our standard RXP emulsion. Now, an above head exposure light, that would actually take 13 minutes almost. So look at the time savings there. If you're starting to process more screens in your shop, investing in a unit like this is going to save you hours of time in screen exposure, and it's going to be huge. So let's go ahead and start the timer and expose this. Now, the entry-level unit doesn't have an automated timer, so I'm just using my iPhone here, and I'm starting the timer, and I'm going to expose it for 3 minutes and 45 seconds. All you have to do is just hit on. Now, obviously, we're in a light-safe environment. We don't have any light coming in from that is not light-safe, so we're in a yellow light-safe environment using yellow bug lights. And we're not looking at this exposure light. This is UV light, so you don't want to leave it on and just stare at it or something like that because it's basically like opening your eyes in a tanning bed. It's not going to ruin your eyes, but it's not good for them either. So let's go ahead, fast forward, finish this exposure, and let's check out Washout. We're coming to the end of our exposure time, so we simply hit the button again, and that stops the exposure. Now let's go to the sink and wash it out. We're in our washout sink. We're still in a light-safe environment. Now, if you do have to take the screen somewhere else to wash it out, what you need to do is you need to get it wet on both sides first, like I'm doing right here. So if you're in a non-light safe environment, to wash out your screens, have like a squirt bottle or something like this in your light safe room. So after you take the screen out of the exposure unit, you can squirt the screen down and soak it. This basically develops the screen and now basically will make it so we can wash it out in a more lit area. Still, even now, I wouldn't recommend washing it out in the sun. Do it in the shade. Once you let the screen sit for about a minute or so, we can go to rinse it out. Now, I like to use just lukewarm water, just standard tap water, and then basic pressure. You don't want to salt like super hard pressure. You want a little bit softer pressure here. That washed out very nicely, very quick. Awesome edge definition here. So we have very good edge definition. Now, you can see here that this screen is slightly underexposed. So my exposure times told me 3.5 minutes to 4 minutes. It probably would have been better if I would have exposed that screen at 4 minutes. It's a little bit underexposed, but still washed out beautifully. So what you want to do is you want to make sure on an underexposed screen, you rinse off that emulsion slime, and then you take a dry newspaper, newsprint, or paper and dab that off, and then put it immediately in front of a fan or out in the sun to dry. Because if you put it in the sun to dry, you can actually post-harden the screen. Now, if it's not sunny outside like it is here in Washington, once this is dry, we can basically put this on top of our exposure unit again. For this next screen exposure, we're going to up the mesh count, so we're going to a 230 mesh. We're also going to a little bit larger screen size, a 20 by 24, and we're exposing some 45-line halftones here. So with an above exposure lamp, it's very hard to get high-quality halftones, and that's one huge reason for upgrading. So really, there's 3 good reasons. It's speed, it's that positive contact for edge definition, which also allows for you to do things like halftones. So we have a nice picture of Portland here with the Washout logo on it, and we're going to be putting this on this exposure unit. Now, with these larger screens, you can't utilize the whole screen surface. The 20 by 24 is the max size of screen you're going to be able to put on this. 16 by 20 is optimal, but 20 by 24 will work. So this fits nicely with silver presses or starter kits that you would purchase from Washout as upgrades. It's an awesome upgrade for any of those kits. So you're going to coat this with either a 16-inch or a 14-inch scoop coater. If you coat it with a 14-inch scoop coater, it's actually a little bit better because you don't have emulsion on the edge over here. With this 16-inch scoop coater that we use here, we do have some emulsion overlapping. So I would recommend probably a 14-inch on that. We're centering the image in the center area of the exposure. If you're pushing the edge of the exposure, go ahead and take your screen back just a little bit and make sure your image is centered in the main light concentrated source of the RXP exposure unit. Now we're going to be using that foam that comes with it and putting it over the image area, and then we're putting that 25 pounds or so of pressure on top of that. Now, because this screen mesh is higher, we're going to up down the exposure time to 3 minutes. So let me start my timer again, and let's go ahead and expose, and then we'll see how the halftones wash out. Here's our halftone exposure using a 230 mesh and 45-line halftone. We ended up exposing this at 3 minutes and 10 seconds because our last exposure was a little bit underexposed. Once again, we're getting the screen wet to develop it on both sides. And there's our exposure. We are still a little bit underexposed here, so we'd probably go up on this to probably 3 minutes, 30 seconds, and we'd be good to go. But you can see the halftone definition here. It retained 10% of the halftone dots, which is really good for a small exposure unit like that. And we can see the image in the Portland design with very crisp lines in the round edge as well. So we have an awesome halftone exposure using this exposure unit, which we could not have done if we were using the above 500 watt exposure light. Wanted to show you how to post-harden a screen. So basically, once your screen's pretty much dry, take it on that exposure unit and just turn the lights on again, and this will post-harden the screen to make the emulsion harder. Now, an underexposed screen does not reclaim as easy because it starts to absorb the ink and the chemicals that you clean it with, and it makes it harder to reclaim. So it's very important to post-harden your screens and to properly expose your screens at the beginning, which the exposure test wedges will tell you how to do so and by following the recommended exposure times. On the both screens in this video, we exposed them okay, but they were both slightly underexposed because we saw some slime on the back of the screens. So you would recommend boosting those exposure times, which we'll do for the next go-around. And with this little exposure test wedge, it easily allows us to test that. Also, just by checking for slime on the back of the screen, we can check. So that's basically one way that you can make a screen harder, which will last longer on your press and be easier to reclaim. We manufacture these RXP 16x20 exposure units right here in Vancouver, Washington, USA, along with all the other exposure units that we sell. If you're looking to step up your game in screen exposure, be able to expose fine detail and halftones, lower your exposure times, and really get a better quality screen, the RXP exposure unit is a great entry-level unit for you. We also manufacture larger exposure units that will even do faster exposure times and finer detail. So check out all the exposure unit options on the screen printing exposure page of our website. Thanks a lot for watching, and good luck on stepping up your screen exposure game.